Innies, long time, no see. Though, as you probably already know, Ricken Hale wrote a book way back in season 1, but what you might not know is that this book exists in the real world. Well, sort of. There's a bit of a caveat. It's not a complete book. The rumor is we will be getting more chapters in the future, but for now we'll have to make do with a few opening chapters. Anyway, this book, The UUR, will be the main course for this evening, because today we're going to zero in on the strange and curious to see what clues might be hiding in these pages. And that's not all. We'll also be revisiting the ORTBO experience because Irving had a dream. Normally not a big deal, but this is any Irv, and that's interesting enough to say the least, and fans have made some observations about this night that might confirm an important question about how Severance actually works. And we'll also revisit a very popular Gemma theory because there's a new take on this theory that makes the whole thing a lot more plausible. Now, before we begin, I cannot forget to shout out the channel patrons. Thank you so much for what you do. And shout out to the entire tinfoil gang. I cannot thank you enough. And of course, I'd like to welcome the newest member to the Patreon, John Varga. Thank you for choosing to support what I do here, and I hope you enjoy seeing your name in lights. All right, gang, I hope you're ready to get lost in the sauce because it's time to dive. So, Ricken Hale, certainly not a stranger to this channel. I dedicated an entire video to this character in season 1 because, despite all appearances, I cannot let go of the feeling that hidden behind the lovable oaf veneer, this literary genius is a far more complex and important character than we're meant to believe. And I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking this. Now, Ricken is a strange one. That's a given. He's an eccentric character that we immediately recognize as someone whose job it is to make us laugh. He's a comedic character for sure, but we've already been witness to the fact that his role in the story is far more significant than just filling in for comic relief. The Severance showrunners pulled out all the stops as far as marketing goes for the show, a necessity given that Apple TV is still a relatively small streaming service. So the inclusion of canonical side content that goes beyond the TV show does a lot to help get the word out. But it also gives us fans more information to work with when we're out here losing our minds constructing theories about this show. One such example is the UUR, which I've had the pleasure of reading and listening to. By the way, Michael Chernus reads the audiobook version and it's top-notch. I laughed, I cried, I pondered the great questions in life, but I also came across some spicy backstory on this character that adds fuel to the theory machine. Let's begin with the very curious relationship Ricken had with Gemma, according to his version of the story. Now, while reading the book, I came across at least 2 occasions where he talks about how he, Devin, Mark, and Gemma would hang out together before Gemma's fateful disappearance. Now, after reading it, it becomes clear that Ricken felt that he was a very misunderstood and underappreciated person, and that he was often the butt of the joke. But Gemma didn't treat him like the others, and that created a special connection, in his mind at least. Ricken seems to set Gemma apart from the others and talk about her in a way that hints at a possible crush. Now, there isn't enough there to say for certain that it goes to that level, but he definitely thought Gemma was special, and it was mostly because she was kinder to him than anyone else had been. Also, during the read, it's impossible to miss his portrayal of his brother-in-law, Mark, as kind of a jerk. His relationship with Mark comes off as kind of hostile when he paints Mark as a somewhat mean-spirited and dismissive person. You could say he's basically a troll. The point is, there is some tension there. And it reminds me of that moment when Mark and Devin show up for the foodless dinner and Mark greets him at the door as Rick, only for Ricken to correct him. I thought that was odd. I mean, that's odd, right? Because usually you don't have to tell your friends what to call you. You would think that conversation would have happened already. Now, part of me wondered if Mark was low-key trolling here, taking a dig at his name perhaps, knowing full well this man doesn't want to be called that. Or the other option, Ricken wasn't always referred to as Ricken until recently. There is a distinct possibility that this is true. Another thing you'll realize immediately upon reading this book is that it is written in the same manner that the author speaks. It's full of that old-timey language, the kind you hear spoken by many of the other Lumon employees. It just smacks of Egan or Lumon influence. It's culty, and it furthers the theory that he either is an Egan or at least was associated with the organization at some point, or it could just be his really strange upbringing. Speaking of connections to Lumon, this is the perfect segue. Ricken mentions doing a stint at an industrial beekeeping facility, and that got my attention for 2 reasons. 1, why does the world need industrial beekeepers unless there's an environmental crisis going on that's threatening our ability to grow food? And secondly, the question has to be asked, did that beekeeping company happen to be Lumon operated? We've been given many hints that in Severance's reality, climate change has altered how the world works, to the point that even Lumon has gotten involved. This is another stick of kindling to add to the flaming pile. I should also mention that Ricken had no idea what a real beehive looked like. Yeah, according to his story, while out on a hike with his 3 amigos, he ran into a beehive. He was puzzled by it and almost touched it because he had no idea what it was. Now here we have a grown man who can't identify a natural beehive, even though he worked in a honey-making facility. It's perfect. But I think this is proof that food is not easy to come by. I mean, if that's not a clue, then I don't know what to tell you. Let's keep it moving. So I want to talk about a crossover between this book, the main storyline, and the related short story, The Lexington Letter. What is the Lexington Letter, you ask? Well, if you don't know, now you know. Check the link in the description if you want to read it first. I recommend that you do. There is a point in the Lexington Letter where the protagonist, a Peggy Kincaid, describes how on completion of the MDR file she was working on, there was a deadly explosion in New York City that involved a truck belonging to Lumon's rival company. Clearly, we're supposed to believe that there's some correlation here. One thing caused the other. The events are linked. I'm not sure how this actually works, but the point here is that this event caused Devin to persuade Ricken to move to a safer place. I'm assuming the current Hale house. Okay, so now what's the connection to the main storyline? Well, that character, Peggy Kincaid from the Lexington Letter, apparently gets deleted in a car accident. She was actually the victim of 2 car accidents, and just like Gemma, the circumstances involved a slippery patch of ice. It was a patch of ice that set Peggy on her path to working for Lumon. There are simply too many coincidences here to ignore it. Actually, you know what? We need to ask another question about Peggy Kincaid. Is she actually gone? Or did she get body snatched like Gemma and forced to exist on the testing floor? I had not thought about that until recently. We gotta move on. So now this one might be nothing, it might be a strange coincidence, but I did find it interesting that the Hales chose to give baby Eleanor, their child, the middle name Rebecca. I don't need to tell you how weird and strangely coincidental that is. Now we're all familiar with Rebecca, one of Ricken's band of seemingly severed stands. Rebecca is an uncommon name, much like the names of many of the Egans, or the aliases that severed employees are given. I don't know, for me, it definitely scratches the Ricken is severed theory itch, and I think it does for a lot of other fans too. Speaking of which, Dan Erickson, the showrunner and writer of the show, had a funny response when he was asked if there are any severed folks that exist outside of Lumon HQ. And his response seemed like the affirmative, but he just couldn't explicitly say as much for fear of spoiling the story. If this is true, my money is on Ricken and his Goof Troop fan club being on that roster. Now, one thing I should definitely mention here is that we have to take everything Ricken says with a boulder of salt. For one, he sees the world through a unique lens, and that makes his perception of things just as unique. We can't always trust that he's not embellishing the story or just straight up making stuff up. And then there's the fact that he gets a lot of basic historical facts wrong. I mean, this stuff is hysterically off base, but it's hilarious because he's just so sure of himself. That said, I think we can believe that what he says is mostly true. I think things are just a bit fuzzy when it comes to the details. The general overall vibe I get from this reading is that Ricken behaves like someone who either is or was once in a cult or a commune. You also get the sense that he doesn't exist in the real world with the rest of us, which might likely be due to his unusual upbringing. And then he's got a lot of money, which, might have him feeling kind of detached. Okay, so it's time to move on to another theory. One that I find really intriguing, and it's completely plausible from what I can tell. It has to do with Gemma and Mark. And the short version of it is that Lumon had been orchestrating everything between Mark and Gemma the entire time. Because the Gemma that Mark knew was a severed version of her real self before they even met. Gemma was essentially the ultimate sleeper agent. The theory posits that Mark's first meeting her at the blood drive was scripted, and Gemma's visits to that Lumon-run fertility clinic were a total farce. Lumon tricked her, making sure she did not have the baby because they wanted to make sure she and Mark were good and traumatized, a prerequisite if they're going to be of any use to the company. We're all in here because we're not all there, comes to mind. The theory states that after the miscarriage, they called Gemma back home by faking her death, and they would have gotten away with it if not for Mark and his meddling MDR buddies. Now before this, I couldn't see Gemma willfully screwing over Mark or faking the miscarriage. That was the biggest problem that I had with the idea of Gemma being a Lumon plant, or at least one of them. But I'd never considered that she could have been working for Lumon without even knowing it herself. I mean, it's kind of perfect if the fertility clinic set her up and she had no idea because she was severed from the start. I do like this one, and I think it's legit. Something to consider. I still think it's strange that Mark meets Gemma at a Lumon blood drive. A Lumon blood drive. It just seems like the writers made sure to insert Lumon's presence into this key event, as if to say they were there from the start. And that scene where they first meet, it makes it seem like Gemma just fell out of the sky. Mark had never seen nor heard of her before. Kinda strange, just saying. Okay, let's pay a visit to Mr. Irving Bailiff for our next theory. And this one has to do with the ORTBO experience, you know, the Winter Wonderland, and that time that Irving decided to sleep under the stars because he was mad that Helena wouldn't quit pretending to be Helly, and nobody, not even Dylan, believed him. Irving disappears into the forest, and then he starts to fade fast, drifting off to La La Land on a rock until he wakes up in a dream. Keyword being dream. Isn't that something innies are normally not allowed to do? They're not allowed to sleep. And in this episode, I think we find out why they don't want them to sleep. We get this sequence where Irving's subconscious mind is able to put 2 and 2 together and solve the case of MDR and the imposter innie. Now, this is interesting because prior to this, the closest we've been to seeing an innie dreaming was Innie Irv's sleep-induced inky hallucinations back at the office. This scene might be telling us that dreams do indeed connect the innies to a shared subconsciousness with their outies, and Lumon doesn't want that. But that's not all this scene may be revealing. Some Severance fans saw these giant blue tents and got to thinking that maybe these tents aren't your normal recreational outdoor camping comforts. These tents are probably designed to prevent the innies from having dreams. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that they chose the color blue here. So basically, Irving was able to break protocol that night because he slept outside of the dream-blocking tent. Lumon uses fancy external devices to monitor and manipulate the chips they've got implanted in these noggins. So the specialized dream-proof tents for innies on an overnight field trip, well, that seems pretty dang plausible. And I'm already wondering what other technologies they're hiding from us. All right. It's that part of the video where I let the tinfoilers take over the show and we take a look at some of the comments from the last Severance video. Let's see what you had to say about Severance's color theory episode. First up, we've got a message from Chris Jackson. The painting with Keir looking out over the lakes. They're arranged roughly like the Great Lakes relative to each other. It really jumped out at me just now. Yeah, good catch. There is reason to believe that those bodies of water do in fact seem to represent the Great Lakes, suggesting that Lumon might have gotten its start in this area of the country. And of course, there's the connection to water again. I can't help but think that maybe this is another hint. Also, shout out to Ravenlord 2 for pointing this out, but also noting that this clue might be hinting to Keir PE, that location, as a hint that this is taking place in Michigan, as in the peninsula. I think that's interesting, and I think you might be onto something there. So next up, we've got the Scott sisters sing. I can't help but think of the Wayward Pines establishing shots from the city when we see the Lumon water tower. As a person who lives on the cusp of a couple of small towns, I'm used to seeing different water towers about every 7 minutes when driving. The fact that the Lumon water tower is framed with the building and adjacent to the Egan compound just feels so isolating. I loved Wayward Pines, and I know exactly what you mean. This tower makes sense from a practical standpoint, but the way they use the company logo and the way that it's framed in the shot and how often it's used in establishing shots seem to speak to it being symbolic of something greater. But yeah, that one shot of the tower near James Egan's massive compound is probably the most ominous shot of it yet. Next up, Omar Locke, and he had this to say. Unpopular opinion. I think the entire show had a perfect ending. Season 2, if it never comes back, would be the perfect ending to the series. There's so much mystery left and so many things left unanswered, but enough was answered, and I hope the show isn't ruined going forward. As far as the first part, I 100% agree. I felt the same thing after the season 2 finale. Of course, I would love to have all of my questions answered, and I would love to see where all of these different story threads go. I do think that this finale would have been the perfect open ending to the story. Open endings, when done right, like say Lost in Translation or The Thing, there's nothing quite like it. As far as the rest of the season, I'm not too worried. Anyway, thanks for the comments, gang. Don't forget, I don't always get to respond, but I do go back and read them. Anyway, that's a wrap on this video. I hope you enjoyed this old school romp through Theoryville with me. Let me know what you think about these finds and share any thoughts or theories of your own. Be safe out there, tinfoilers, and remember to always be kind to yourself first. And until next time, off you go.